So what we're going to talk about today, as I mentioned, is the role of nonprofits and government relations activities during election year and the importance of nonprofit advocacy. So the big picture is that we know that when communities are engaged in talking to government, when government understands what communities need, what their aspirations are, that's good for democracy. So when governments and communities become less connected for lots of reasons, democratic engagement decreases. So that means people don't think politics affects their lives, people lose trust in their institutions. And there is something called the trust index, and we are seeing that the trust in institutions is lowering in Canada. People don't get involved in the political process, and ultimately fewer people vote. And often it's because they feel that disconnect. And as a result of all of those things, when government and communities become less connected, our communities suffer because they are not able to share their aspirations, their needs, their ideas with governments, and governments may not represent or respect what's happening at a community level. So the big picture is it's really important for democracy that government and communities stay connected in that way. Next slide, please. So you can see the spiral effect. So if government makes policy that doesn't reflect the needs of the community, people don't think they're heard and government doesn't want to hear from them. And then people lose interest in the policy process. And I'm sure you've been chatting about policy processes and government relations throughout the day, which could be as formal as meeting an MPP, but it could be lots of other activities that we're going to talk about in a minute. So it's so important for us to think about the nonprofits' role in ensuring that communities and democracy and governments connect. Next slide, please. So essentially, this is just previous to the last provincial election in Ontario. ONN worked with the Samara Centre for Democracy and we thought long and hard about what is the nonprofit role at election times. And we came up with this infographic, which you can download on our website. And it really, what we ended up really coming to after talking to our networks and folks that have been participating in government relations is that nonprofits are the bridge often between community and government. So we have community needs, community aspirations, we have government making policy, making decisions, and the nonprofit sector can really build those bridges between community and government. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So one example is the opioid crisis that's been hitting many of our communities across Canada in a very tragic way. In the early days of this crisis, it was the nonprofit sector, it was service providers on the ground that brought to the attention of policymakers and government what was happening. They were, if you want, the early responders, you know, the first responders to see that there was an emerging issue in our communities. You know, another example is certainly in the pandemic. Many nonprofits bridge that role between communities and government. And a great example of this is around the vaccine rollout. There's a story about, there's a really great story that happened in Peel, just north of Toronto, where there was high levels of COVID during the second or third wave. And it really was nonprofits and charities on the ground that knew communities, that were trusted voices and intermediaries of communities that rallied and figured out how to meet the diverse needs of their community and ensure that they had the information they needed to make choices around vaccination. So again, the nonprofits and charities were bridging that gap between communities and government. So, you know, when we did this thinking before the last election, which still holds true, we envisioned, you know, a system where we had a thriving nonprofit sector, and you'll see there arts, sports, healthcare, legal, education, like the depth and the breadth of our sector that can help build smart, sustainable programs and policies that support communities. If we have that, as well as engaged communities where people are sharing their concerns and offering solutions and building answers, that will lead to a cycle of having an effective government where strong democratic engagement really builds community support. So it really is a system, if we all play the roles that we're capable of playing and that we keep our lines of communication open. So where do we specifically fit in? Well, we've done, you know, been thinking about this, especially in a time of election. Why do nonprofits and charities, grassroots groups, formal charities, big organizations, small organizations, Why do they play a unique role when it comes to elections? Well, for one, they increase awareness. They can increase the awareness and understanding of community challenges and opportunities. So they have a platform, they have social media, they have events, they have lots of activities. So they play a role just like they do for their programs and services, with increasing the awareness both to government of what the community needs are, and to communities about what the opportunities for governments are. They listen to patterns and can identify issues and opportunities across communities and regions, particularly when they work with associations. So for example, museums. Museums have an association in Ontario, it's called the Ontario Museum Association, that brings them together and identifies issues and patterns that are happening across charitable museums in our province. And so nonprofits really have that unique role about being able to identify patterns of what's happening at a community level. Nonprofits and charities are excellent at convening, connecting people and groups to create opportunities in communities for conversations. They can host events, town halls, they can bring their participants together and share information. It is such a critical role that our sector plays. They can also build capacity, so they can share knowledge and research to their communities and again, up to government. So for example, this could be on how to vote. There's lots of information out there from Elections Ontario on how to vote, and a nonprofit or charity can make sure that their communities, their constituents and program participants have information about how to vote, which is a completely appropriate charitable activity. As long as you don't tell people who to vote for, it's really important for our sector to be able to share how people can vote and what the process looks like, especially to folks that may be new to our systems. Nonprofits also play a unique role in demanding accountability. So really being having that voice to hold government and decision makers accountable for something they may have said or they may have promised during a pre-election period or in previous governments, because many of the communities that we serve don't have that ability to demand accountability. It either puts them at risk as individuals, or it doesn't convene a bunch of voices to be able to ask government to do something. So we play a really important role there. And finally, a fundamental role of the nonprofit and charitable sector is to strengthen the voices of the communities we serve, to make sure that we support those folks with lived experience, people in our community, to speak up and be confident and really share what communities care about. So all of these are unique roles that we play, and really, really important during an election period. One of the things that we think about when we think about advocacy in the nonprofit and charitable sector is, there has been a chill for many, many years that nonprofits and charities specifically can't advocate. So we know that's not the case. In fact, we now have rules that say charities and nonprofits can do unlimited political or policy advocacy, and Candace is going to walk you through some of the rules in a moment. So what does that mean, though? Well, it means, first of all, it does need to be nonpartisan. So you can't endorse a specific candidate, for example, but you can share information on the issues that you care about. And there's a huge number of ways you can do that. Look at this spectrum of advocacy, and it doesn't necessarily have a beginning and an end. It is often for a specific issue. You might do 2 or 3 of these things, or your organization might do one of these activities for one issue and might choose a different strategy or an advocacy tactic for another issue. So what's really important is to recognize there's a whole bunch of things that you can do in terms of advocating during an election and also between election periods. So you can have a social media campaign, you can start a petition, you can meet with government representatives, you can host a town hall, you can meet with cabinet ministers. Right now I'm in Ottawa for a lobby day that's been organized by Imagine Canada. You can write an op-ed. So there's lots of things you can do to share the concerns of your communities and also, again, align with what your organization's mission is. So usually organizations sort of decide what tactics they use based on a lot of things, what they think is going to be successful, but also based on their own organizational culture and how they work with politicians, work with their communities. And so some folks are very comfortable organizing a protest. Others would prefer to write joint letters. that's completely fine. What we want to share is that all of it is okay. And there may be different times when you may be called on to do different things as part of your advocacy work. But fundamentally, building relationships, especially during the pre-election and election period, is key. So elections provide us with a great opportunity to activate and build your networks. Particularly if you take a network approach, what we often call collective advocacy at this time, so during an election period. And what that means is that you work with other organizations to share the same key messages with the candidates that are running for office in your area, or your potential MPPs or your potential MP. That takes the onus off a single organization, but it also spreads the workload, frankly. But it is a great time to build relationships, because before they get elected, politicians are very interested in making sure they have a good handle on what's happening in their communities and that they have the relationships they need to do their job. And usually it's actually a bit easier to get meetings with candidates who are running for office. So there's nothing wrong with meeting with candidates before an election and during an election. In fact, ONN, we met with one this morning for the provincial election. What's important, of course, is that you try and meet with candidates from all the political parties. And you also make sure that you don't endorse a single candidate. Again, that gets into the rules that we'll talk about. But really, during an election time, often nonprofits and charities think it's not the right time to do government relations. And in fact, what we've learned is it's a better time. It's a really good time to do government relations. And I'll share you why we learned that. Back in the last provincial election in Ontario, we had a Liberal government in Ontario for many years, over a decade. And ONN was started when we started. We had a liberal government. And what happened was when the Conservatives got elected with majority, we actually hadn't built those relationships. We'd been so busy working with the current government, we hadn't spent enough time with opposition members. So we learned the hard way how important it was to engage in working with all the parties and all of the candidates before an election actually happens. I think I'm going to turn it over to Candace now to talk about specific ways you can engage and give you some examples of what we've seen during the provincial election here in Ontario, and also talk about some things to think about in terms of the rules. And we're going to stick around for some questions and answers, so please feel free to share them in the chat. So over to you, Candace.
Thank you, Kathy. So before we dive into the various ways nonprofits can advocate during an election year, I want to just very quickly point out some laws regarding nonprofit election advocacy. It's always helpful to be informed on the rules around the election. So in Ontario, these laws include the Income Tax Act, Election Finances Act, and the Lobbyist Registration Act. To help organizations better understand these rules, ONN has actually created some resources that break down the rules. So I will put the link in the chat momentarily, but here we have an election toolkit where we have a whole section on to break down the rules under those laws. So folks who are interested in learning more about these rules can find out more in the toolkit. But the main message is that nonprofits absolutely can and should advocate. Like Kathy mentioned earlier, I want to quickly highlight that once again, registered charities are allowed to engage in political activities. Actually, in 2018, the Income Tax Act was amended to allow charitable organizations to engage without any limitation in nonpartisan public policy dialogue and development activities. And advocating on an issue will not be considered partisan merely because a candidate or a party is closely associated with an issue. And this is specifically for registered charities. Okay, so next I'm going to go over some examples of the different ways nonprofits have engaged in election advocacy this year, leading up to the provincial election in Ontario on June 2nd. So a really great way to demonstrate to the public and the candidates that the issue you're working on matter is through awareness raising activities. And a very effective way to do so is through op-eds. There is power in our stories, and this is a great way to get the attention of parties and candidates, especially during elections. Political parties often set up media monitoring teams. So here we have an example from the Daily Bread Food Bank, where they wrote an article highlighting a recent report that they published on the food bank usage. So this is a great way to showcase that, during elections, you don't necessarily always have to be directly using the word election or vote to talk about the issue. You can simply highlight a recent research or report in an op-ed to raise the awareness of the issue that you're working on. At the same time, it's also a really great way to talk about, what you want to see from different political parties during the election. So here we have an op-ed written by Faye Johnstone. They are the executive director of Wisdom to Action, where in this op-ed, they talked about how political parties must step up on LGBTQ2+ issues. And another really great way to raise awareness about our issue is through social media. We can all kind of see how over the past 2 years, everyone has been spending a lot more time on social media because of the pandemic, and social media platforms have been utilized to mobilize people in very innovative ways. So Twitter, for example, offers a really great feature for campaigns with their hashtag feature. So here we have an example from the Ontario Co-op Association, where they are talking about, they are encouraging folks in their network to use a hashtag #AllTogetherNow on their election social media post or any other post to share about the value and the importance of the cooperative sector in Ontario. And we also have another example from CMHO, where they launched a campaign just recently on May 4th, where it's like a Twitter chat to encourage folks to talk about kids' mental health in Ontario. And they're utilizing the hashtag #KidsCan'tWait. And also a lot of candidates and party leaders, they are on Twitter. So it's really great. It's really great when you're sharing those posts and your messages to at the same time tag your candidates to get their attention, to have a conversation with them at the same time. Also here we have an example from Advocacy Toronto. They're using the hashtag choose gender equity, where they are sharing like a very concise message what they're hoping to see the parties commit to during the election. So another really great way to engage in election advocacy is to share resources created by other organizations in your network with your members and your broader network. ONN, for example, recently added a new section in our monthly newsletter dedicated to sharing resources and events related to the Ontario election. So here's an example where we have a section on different resources created by various organizations, live party platform analysis from other organizations, as well as some events hosted by other organizations. And very similarly, it is very important to amplify the voices of others. There might be community organizing or grassroots efforts already successfully underway. So instead of reinventing the wheel, think about the different ways that we can amplify these existing initiatives. What are the ways how we can maybe provide a platform for them to reach a bigger audience? For example, if your organization have a really big social media following, a really great way is to share events and the posts from other grassroots organizations from your community. Here we have an example from Health Providers Against Poverty. They retweeted a rally that's being held by the Decent Work and Health Network. It's also very important that we support our communities to get out and vote. As nonprofits, many of us serve communities who face a lot of barriers to voting. And it's very important that we make sure their voices are heard during the election. And a great way, like what's so great about engaging your communities to support them to get out and vote is that you don't actually necessarily have to create your own resources to do so. For example, the Democratic Engagement Exchange, they actually offer a toolkit, a vote pop-up toolkit that is free for other organizations to use to host get out and vote events. And Election Ontario as well, they also have workshops and resources that are free for organizations as well. Here we have an example from North York Harvest Food Bank, who recently had a voter pop-up mocking voting event, which really highlights how you don't necessarily have to be a civic engagement organization to host those events. Even if you're a food bank, a homeless shelter, it's really important that you also have those kind of events, because we are directly working with those communities. It's easier for us to reach them. Another example is from the Canadian Muslim Vote, Get Out and Vote campaign. They actually set up those booths across in mosques across the province to engage their communities and to talk to them about why it is important for them to vote. And since recently the writ has been drawn in Ontario, it is a really great way to engage with candidates by hosting debates. Just yesterday, during one of the conferences, there was a Northern Leaders debate as part of the conference. And back in April, for example, the Ontario Equal Pay Coalition also had a live election debate with candidates from all parties. And similarly, organizations can host events such as panel discussions and webinars. For panel discussions, it is really great. It's a really great way to highlight your priorities for the upcoming election. But alternatively, you can also host webinars to talk about how organizations or individuals can be more engaged in the upcoming election. For example, ONN had a webinar on election advocacy, what nonprofits need to know, where we went through all of the rules and the different ways that nonprofits can engage in election advocacy. And Ontario for All also had a roundtable where they brought together all of the organizations who share similar goals to talk about what their priorities are and to kind of like identify common messages and common goals. At the same time, meeting with candidates and political parties is another great way to inform candidates about the work your nonprofit is doing and bring community issues to their attention. You can write to candidates to ask for a meeting, or alternatively, you can also invite them to one of the events that you're hosting. If you don't have the resources or time to organize an event yourself, you can simply attend another event hosted by a different organization where candidates are speaking. During those events, usually towards the end, there's a Q&A session where you get to kind of like ask candidates about questions about the issues that you are working on. And once again, to remain nonpartisan, make sure that you reach out to candidates from all parties. Government relations and meeting with candidates and political parties is about the long game. it is about building a stronger and long-term relationship with candidates, and to encourage candidates to become champions for community organizations and community issues. A current candidate may become a cabinet minister down the road. So it is very important that we reach out to them before the election. And even after the election, it is a really great way to, send them a congratulatory letter, and to ask for meetings to follow up with them and to once again reiterate the issues that you're working on. And here we have some example from Community Living Toronto, and you can see they've met with candidates from different parties, including Ontario NDP, Ontario Liberal, and the Ontario Greens, and they are also utilizing social media to kind of, promote that they've been talking to candidates on those issues with a screenshot from their meeting. And another great way to engage in election advocacy is to share your organization's election priorities. Some example here, we have Spinal Cord Injury Ontario, where they have a dedicated webpage, including an advocate toolkit, but also the issues that they're working on and different ways that you can take action. And here we have some more examples. Vote Dementia, where they're talking about a 2022 dementia platform. And from our own organization, ONN, we have our election priorities document as well, which is called Building Thriving Communities with a Nonprofit Sector. And depends on your resources and your energy level and your staff time, you can have an entire webpage with beautiful designs to showcase your election priorities, or alternatively, you can just simply have like a PDF document, which is kind of like what we did with our election priorities, with our logo. Very simple design, doesn't take a lot of time to do so. And finally, I just want to highlight again the power of collective advocacy. Sometimes there's some confusions around whether or not, during election year, organizations are allowed to do collective advocacy. And I just want to reiterate that absolutely yes, organizations can and should come together and do collective advocacy. Here we have an example of a campaign which is partnership between the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association and the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. They recently launched a campaign called Vote for Housing Ontario. For the very recent federal election, they also had a similar Vote for Housing campaign on the federal level as well. And as you can see, they have like endorsement from all those different organizations who work on similar issues. They have a dedicated webpage to ask folks to spread the word and to use the hashtag Vote for Housing. And they share different ways that different organizations and individuals can collectively advocate on the same issue with some shared messaging. Here we have another example from called Queer Vote Ontario 2022. And as you can see, the coalition list in the middle here is a very long list of many different organizations working on similar issues. And it's just such a great way to come together and to amplify each other's voices. So with all those different strategies in mind, it's very important to kind of set a goal before you decide which strategies you want to use when you engage in election advocacy. And one of the framework that I like very much is called SMART, which I'm sure a lot of the folks in the audience are probably already very familiar with. It stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And to share some examples, if your goal is to influence the party platforms, the way that you can kind of like measure your success include to think about, are your priorities reflected in parties' platforms? If so, how many parties took on your priorities? If you have a list of different priorities, how many of those were included in parties' election platforms? And if that is your goal, the strategies that you might want to use could include, having meetings with different candidates, or utilizing social media or your website to highlight your election priorities. But it's also important to keep in mind, with your current resources and time, is it realistic to achieve this goal? Another example is to raise the profile. If your goal is to raise the profile of the issue that you're working on, you can measure the success by measuring the number of knowledge products produced to raise the awareness of your issue, or new audience reached on your social media platform or other communication channels. And you can think about whether or not your goal is more short-term or long-term, and what do you need to do to achieve your goals, and whether or not you need to kind of achieve your goals before the writ drops. Just to be aware of time, to conclude our presentation, I would like to just reiterate that no action is too small during an election year. Even during challenging times like right now with the pandemic and the global uncertainties and the inflation, there are still times and space. There are still moments and spaces for us to make our voices heard. And we really encourage folks to find their role, to engage. Yeah, that concludes today's presentation. I'm going to pass it back to maybe Kathy, if you have anything that you wanted to add.
That's great, Candace. Thank you so much. It's really helpful to see all those examples of what people are doing and different ways that they're doing it as well during the elections. So I think we probably have just a few minutes for questions. And I'm unfortunately, I do have to pop off soon, but I know Candace is available. So Puneet, happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. Again, so many practical tips for everyone who's listening today. One of the things that I wanted to ask was this idea of, because there's so many things that nonprofits can do during an election, outside of an election, how do you sort of create that perfect mix of advocacy tools that works for your organization? You can look at, CCBO, for example, lots of research, lots of papers and documents and, that kind of stuff. But if that doesn't work for an organization, what would you suggest would be a good mix for them to make sure that they're doing it well and that they're reaching the audience that they're trying to reach?
Oh, such a great question. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to two things. One is mission, and what their mission is, and what information, what they're passionate about. And the second is what their capacity is, as an organization. So for a lot of local nonprofits and charities, telling their stories is the most important thing. They don't need research. They don't need fancy flyers. They don't need to create a door-to-door campaign with hundreds of volunteers. They need to meet with their candidates and tell the stories of why they exist and who they're trying to serve and why it's important to government to know that. So I think it's thinking about, what would best serve their mission, and how they can use the capacity they have, the information they already have at their fingertips, whether it's research or surveys from program participants or awareness of what the gaps are in their community, and use those pieces as an opportunity to build relationships. But at the end of the day, honestly, what I have learned, it really truly is about building relationships, and sometimes that's very informal. Meeting the MPP at the at the market on Saturday morning, or a candidate, and saying, by the way, did you know our organization exists? When you have time, come for a tour.
Yeah, excellent advice. It's exactly what I hear in my work as well. And it's I don't know if you were on the line when Anjum spoke, but Anjum spoke about really sort of deciding where you are the expert, right? And really leveraging that. So thank you so much. It looks like I know you have a meeting with a minister that you have to go to. So good luck with that. I think you're going to be fine. It looks like you know your GR and advocacy, right? So, and I would like to say, it looks like you're the Ontario Nonprofit Network's advocacy map is going to be one of the more popular documents throughout Canada, I would say right now, because everyone seems to be using that. So thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Candice. And feel free to stay and rejoin if you can after your meetings. But thanks again. Thank you both.
Thank you.